The words sliced through the courtroom like a blade, the stunned silence suffocating everyone. "You're the killer." Those simple words from Emma Richards echoed in the air, shattering the tension that had been building for weeks. The entire room froze. The judge's gavel slipped from his hand, clattering noisily against the wooden bench. The lawyers, who had been moving about with confident, practiced gestures, now sat stiff, their eyes wide with disbelief. The jury gasped as one, their chairs creaking in the silence. Even the reporters, who had been furiously snapping photos and preparing to document every second, had stopped, their cameras now frozen, as if they too could not move. The air itself felt heavier, thick with something unspoken. Emma, just 15 years old, stood at the center of it all. Her body trembled, but her voice was unwavering, loud and full of raw emotion. The tears in her eyes reflected her pain, but there was an unyielding fury burning within them. Her gaze locked onto Judge Gregory Stanton, the man at the head of this trial. The man who had spent decades presiding over cases, delivering verdicts, and enforcing the law. But now, Emma was accusing him of something far worse than a simple miscarriage of justice. The judge's face turned pale. His mouth opened as if he intended to say something, but no words came out. He stood frozen in place, just like everyone else, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. The tension in the room was unbearable. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move, as if doing so would shatter the fragile moment. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she took a shaky step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what you did," she said, the words hanging heavy in the air. A deafening silence followed. No one moved. No one breathed. And then, as if an invisible wall had been broken, chaos erupted. "Order in the court!" The bailiff's shout cut through the stillness, and in an instant, security guards rushed into the room, their footsteps heavy as they moved toward Emma. The lawyers jumped from their seats, shouting, and the judge's assistant hurried to the bench. But Emma didn't back down. She stood tall, despite the tremor in her hand, as she pointed directly at Judge Stanton. The man who had overseen countless trials, the one who was supposed to uphold the law, was now accused by a 15-year-old girl of something far darker. The courtroom was in disarray. The reporters leapt from their seats, cameras flashing wildly as they tried to capture the scene. The judge struggled to regain his composure, his hands shaking as he attempted to assert some form of authority. "You will explain yourself, young lady," he finally managed to croak, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. Emma swallowed hard, the weight of every pair of eyes in the room focused on her. She stood her ground, her fingers clenched into fists at her sides. She had spoken the truth. Now she just had to survive the aftermath. 2 months earlier, Emma Richards had never imagined herself in a courtroom, let alone in the center of a storm that would expose corruption at the highest levels of government. She had been just a regular high school student, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood with her mother and younger brother. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was normal. It was safe. But then, everything changed. It started with a disappearance. Her father, Detective Robert Richards, had been investigating a high-profile case involving some of the most powerful people in the state. The kind of case that didn't make headlines. The kind that stayed in the shadows because the people involved were too dangerous to expose. Her father had always been a man of integrity, someone who taught Emma about kindness, empathy, and standing up for what was right. He had told her, "Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about making things right." But one night, he didn't come home. At first, the police suggested he might have gone missing of his own volition. Perhaps the stress of the job had overwhelmed him, and he had run off. But Emma knew better. Her father would never leave them. He had never shown any signs of wanting to disappear. Days turned into weeks, and the police investigation slowed to a crawl. They treated her mother like a widow before they had even found a body, and the case quickly became a cold file. Emma's mother pleaded with the officers to continue searching, but it was as if her father had never existed. But Emma couldn't accept that. She refused to believe her father was gone. He had been investigating something big. She could feel it. Emma began to search through his files, his notebooks, piecing together the fragments of information he had left behind. One name kept appearing: Judge Gregory Stanton. Emma's stomach twisted when she saw it. Judge Stanton was one of the most respected judges in the state, known for his tough stance on crime. He had put countless criminals behind bars. But why was his name in her father's notes? Why had her father suspected him? Emma's search grew more desperate as she dug deeper. The more she uncovered, the darker the picture became. It wasn't just a simple case of corruption. There was something much larger at play, something that involved powerful figures who controlled the very system that was supposed to protect the people. One night, Emma found something she wasn't prepared for: a single page, hidden deep in her father's desk drawer. It was crumpled, as if her father had shoved it there in a hurry. The name at the top of the page, Judge Gregory Stanton, was followed by a list of names, some of which Emma recognized. People who had disappeared. People who had testified against Stanton in court and then vanished without a trace. That was when Emma realized the terrifying truth. Her father had been close to something huge, something that could bring down the whole system. And now he was gone. But Emma wouldn't stop. She couldn't. Emma knew what she had to do: expose the truth. Life had been ordinary for Emma Richards. At least, it had been before everything came crashing down. A normal teenager, a quiet life in a suburban neighborhood with her mother and younger brother, Max. There were no hidden dangers lurking in their home, no corrupt officials manipulating the system. Emma's world was small, safe, and predictable. But that was before her father, Detective Robert Richards, vanished without a trace. Emma often thought back to the days before everything spiraled out of control. She remembered how her father would spend long hours at the office, coming home late, his eyes tired but sharp with purpose. He was a man of integrity, a man who believed in the power of justice, and he taught Emma to see the world through a lens of fairness and empathy. His lessons were more than just about right and wrong. They were about making the world a better place. "Justice isn't always about punishment, Emma," he would say, his voice steady but full of passion. "It's about making things right. It's about standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves." She used to believe that with all her heart. She thought the world worked that way. She thought the good guys always won. But when her father disappeared, those lessons started to feel like lies. At first, Emma and her mother, Sarah, held on to hope. They convinced themselves that her father had simply taken a break, maybe even gone undercover for a case that had gotten too dangerous. But when the weeks turned into months and the police investigation slowed to a crawl, Emma's hope began to fade. They told her mother to move on, to accept that Robert Richards was gone for good. He was probably dead, they said, or worse. He had chosen to disappear. But Emma couldn't accept that. Her father wasn't the type of man to walk away from his family, especially not under these circumstances. She remembered their last conversation like it was yesterday. He had pulled her aside before leaving for work one morning, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes serious. "Keep your head up, kiddo. You've got a good heart. Don't let the world steal that from you." She knew something was wrong. Her father had been working on a case, something big, something that wasn't supposed to be in the public eye. The kind of case that never made the news, the kind that dealt with corruption at the highest levels. Emma remembered how he had mentioned powerful figures in the government, people who hid behind closed doors, protected by their status and wealth. He had spoken about them in hushed tones, warning her that the real criminals didn't always wear masks. Sometimes they wore suits and sat behind desks, hidden in plain sight. It wasn't long before Emma started to suspect that her father's disappearance was connected to his work. Her mother begged the police to continue the investigation, but they seemed uninterested, almost as if they were too willing to let the case die. They were treating it as if he had left voluntarily, perhaps because the stress of the job had gotten to him, they said. But Emma refused to accept that. One night, while searching through her father's belongings, Emma found something that shook her to the core. It was a single page, buried at the bottom of his desk drawer, crumpled as though it had been hidden away in a hurry. It was a list of names, and at the top, written in bold letters, was the name Judge Gregory Stanton. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She knew that name. Everyone did. Judge Stanton was one of the most respected judges in the state, a man who had put countless criminals behind bars. He had a reputation for being fair, impartial, a man who was always on the right side of justice. But why had her father written down his name? Why had he been investigating him? Emma's stomach twisted. She knew deep down that her father had stumbled onto something dangerous, something so big that it had cost him everything. She felt the weight of the realization crashing down on her. Judge Gregory Stanton wasn't just a judge. He was part of something far darker than anyone could imagine. And her father had been getting too close to the truth. Determined to uncover the whole story, Emma started looking through her father's case files. She scoured every note, every scrap of paper he had left behind. She read through old court cases, watching video footage of trials and listening to interviews. Slowly, a picture began to form. A pattern emerged, one that made her blood run cold. People who had testified against Stanton had disappeared. Some had been found dead, while others had simply vanished, as if they had never existed at all. The deeper Emma dug, the darker the truth became. This wasn't just a case of a corrupt judge. It was the tip of the iceberg. It was a network of power, corruption, and murder that reached far beyond the courthouse. But Emma wasn't alone in her investigation. As she delved further into the mystery, she started to feel like someone was watching her. At first, it was subtle. An unfamiliar car parked outside her school, a shadow lurking outside her house. Then, one night, everything changed. She woke to the sound of glass shattering. She barely had time to react before she heard heavy footsteps downstairs. Her heart raced as she reached for her phone, her hand trembling. But before she could dial 911, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Emma crept through the dark house, trying to stay as quiet as possible. She heard the creak of floorboards as the intruder moved through the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat, and she pressed her back against the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. The minutes felt like hours. Then, after what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Emma didn't dare move for a long time. She waited, listening for any sound, any movement. Finally, after what seemed like forever, she opened her eyes and allowed herself to breathe again. The house was empty, but the files were gone. And on her bedroom mirror, taped in bold black letters, was a single note. Stop digging. Her blood ran cold. The message was clear. Whoever was behind her father's disappearance didn't want her to continue searching for the truth. They wanted her to stop, or else. But Emma wasn't about to back down. She couldn't. She had to keep going. Because now, she understood. Her father had been right. He had been investigating Judge Gregory Stanton. He had been close to uncovering the truth. And now, she was the only one who could finish what he had started. Emma couldn't let go of the truth. Not after everything she had uncovered. Not after what had happened to her father. The note left in her bedroom, the warning to stop digging, only fueled her determination. She wasn't about to back down. She had come too far, and she was ready to take on whatever came next, no matter how dangerous it was. Every night after school, Emma would retreat to her room, poring over her father's old notes, case files, and records. She had become obsessed with the details. It wasn't just a matter of proving that her father hadn't abandoned them. It was about exposing the truth behind his disappearance. She was certain that Judge Gregory Stanton was part of something far bigger than anyone could imagine. Emma had found clues, patterns that no one else seemed to notice. The names on her father's list, people who had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances, were all connected to the cases that Stanton had overseen. It wasn't just a corrupt judge. It was a system, a network of powerful people who controlled the justice system itself. But as she dug deeper, Emma realized just how dangerous her search was becoming. She had already seen the warning signs. The black car that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The shadowy figure that appeared outside her house late at night. She knew that someone was watching her, but she had no choice. She had to keep going. One evening, after a long day of searching through files, Emma received a text message from a number she didn't recognize. It simply read, "Stop looking into Stanton. It's bigger than you think." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the message. She felt a chill run down her spine. She was being hunted. Her every move monitored. She knew she couldn't keep going at this pace, but she also couldn't stop. If she did, her father's investigation would die with him. Determined to find something concrete, Emma decided to meet with a former colleague of her father's, a woman who might know something important. Her name was Linda Grayson, and she had worked as a court reporter covering cases involving Stanton. Emma had reached out to Linda weeks earlier, and they had arranged to meet at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Emma arrived early, nervous but hopeful. She was desperate for answers, anything that could help her connect the dots. She sat at a corner table, her fingers nervously tapping against her coffee cup. Time seemed to stretch on, and Linda hadn't shown up. Minutes passed, then an hour. Emma's nerves were starting to fray. She checked her phone again, but there were no new messages. Something didn't feel right. It was then that she saw the news report flash on the TV at the coffee shop. Tragic car accident claims the life of Linda Grayson. Emma froze. Her stomach dropped. Linda had been killed in a car accident on the way to their meeting. Emma's blood ran cold. She had been about to meet Linda, and now the woman was dead. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she knew it wasn't a coincidence. Linda had been about to give her information about Stanton. She had been a key part of Emma's investigation, and now she was gone. Just like that. The fear that had been growing in Emma's chest exploded into panic. Whoever was behind her father's disappearance wasn't just targeting him. They were targeting her, too. She was next. The thought was terrifying, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep going. She had no choice. That night, as Emma returned home, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if she was never truly alone. She couldn't shake the sense that someone was right behind her, just out of sight, waiting for her to slip up. Her every step felt like it was being tracked. She tried to tell herself, that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. After all, she had been through so much. But the sensation wouldn't go away. That night, as she tried to sleep, she heard it. The faintest sound of glass shattering downstairs. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She grabbed her phone, but before she could dial 911, the lights went out, plunging the house into darkness. Her breath hitched in her chest as she scrambled to find a flashlight. Then she heard it. The sound of footsteps moving through the house, slow and deliberate. The intruder was inside. Emma froze, pressing herself against the wall as she heard the footsteps grow louder. She didn't know if she could make it to the door without being caught. She gripped the edge of the closet door, her hands shaking, her mind racing. Minutes felt like hours as the intruder moved closer. Emma closed her eyes, willing herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to panic now. She had to be smart. When the footsteps finally stopped, Emma barely dared to breathe. Silence hung in the air like a thick blanket. After what felt like an eternity, she cautiously opened her eyes. The house was still, the only sound the pounding of her heart in her ears. The intruder was gone, but the damage had been done. Her father's files, everything she had been working on, were gone. Someone had taken them. Taped to the mirror in her room was a single note, written in bold black letters. "Stop digging." Emma's blood ran cold as she read the words. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare her. They were trying to erase her. Erase everything she had worked for. But Emma wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. She had just realized the truth. Her father's investigation had led him to something so big, so dangerous, that people were willing to kill to keep it hidden. And now, Emma was in the middle of it all. The danger was real, but so was the truth. She couldn't let anyone silence her. Not now, not ever. Emma knew it was getting dangerous, but she refused to stop. Her heart raced with fear, but her resolve was stronger. Whoever had taken her father's files and left that chilling note behind was not just trying to intimidate her. They were trying to silence her. She was getting closer to the truth, and they would do anything to prevent her from uncovering it. The sense of being watched never left her. Every shadow, every passing car, felt like a threat. The streets seemed emptier at night, the quiet more unsettling. She no longer felt safe in her own home, but she had no choice. She couldn't stop now, not after what she had uncovered. But even as Emma deepened her investigation, she was growing increasingly aware of the risks. The things she had learned weren't meant for someone like her. She was just a 15-year-old girl, and yet she had become entangled in a web of corruption, murder, and dark secrets that could take down an entire system. If she didn't tread carefully, she knew she could disappear just like her father had. But even the thought of that didn't scare her. Not anymore. Her father's disappearance had been the catalyst, but now it was so much bigger. The corruption she had uncovered reached into the highest levels of power. Judge Gregory Stanton wasn't just a corrupt judge. He was part of a much larger network that controlled the justice system, bending it to their will. Emma had seen the names connected to him, the people who had gone missing, those who had been silenced. She had to expose them all. But the more she dug, the more dangerous it became. It was late one night when the real threat hit. Emma was working late in her room, hunched over her father's old case files, her eyes tired but determined. She had barely noticed the sound of footsteps outside. It wasn't until she heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering downstairs that her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, the blood draining from her face. Her mind raced as she grabbed her phone, ready to dial 911, but just as her finger hovered over the screen, the lights flickered, and the entire house was plunged into darkness. Her pulse quickened as she dropped the phone, her hands trembling. She had to move. Whoever was inside wasn't here to just scare her. They were after something, and she couldn't let them take what she had uncovered. She stood in the dark for a moment, listening intently. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate, like the intruder was searching for something. Emma held her breath, her body rigid with fear. She knew she had to act fast, but there was nowhere to hide. Her heart was pounding in her ears as she crept toward the closet, trying not to make a sound. Minutes dragged on like hours, the silence heavy with anticipation. The intruder's footsteps grew louder, closer, until Emma could hear them in the hallway outside her bedroom. Her mind raced as she pressed her back against the closet door. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. If she made a sound, they would find her. She waited in the dark, holding her breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The minutes seemed endless, but at last, the footsteps stopped. The house was silent again. Emma didn't dare move. She stayed in the closet, her hands clutching the edges of the door, her body trembling. Time passed, but she couldn't make herself leave her hiding spot. She knew that if she moved too quickly, if she made any noise, she would be caught. She had to wait. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she dared to open the door. The house was still. She slowly stepped out, her eyes scanning the dark hallway. Nothing seemed out of place, but her gut told her something was wrong. She felt it deep in her bones. She rushed to her bedroom, only to find it in disarray. Papers were scattered across the floor, the bedclothes torn and thrown aside. Her heart sank as she scanned the room. She had been searching for something to help prove her father's case, and now it was gone. Everything was gone. Her father's files, the ones that had connected Stanton to the larger conspiracy, were missing. And then she saw it. Taped to her bedroom mirror was another note. The same bold black letters stared back at her. "Stop digging." Emma's stomach twisted as she stared at the note. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare her. They were trying to erase everything. They had come into her home, taken what they needed, and left a warning. She wasn't just dealing with petty criminals anymore. This was something much bigger. Her father had known too much, and they had killed him to cover it up. And now, they were after her. The thought of what had happened to her father, the reason he had disappeared, made her blood run cold. He had been investigating something so dangerous that those at the top of the system were willing to kill anyone who got too close. Emma didn't know who was behind it, but she knew one thing for sure. If she kept digging, she would end up just like him. But Emma refused to stop. She couldn't let fear control her. Not after everything she had seen. The people responsible for her father's disappearance, for all the pain they had caused, needed to be exposed. She wasn't going to let them win. The danger had grown too real for comfort. But Emma understood now. She wasn't just uncovering a conspiracy. She was fighting for her life. And she wasn't going to stop until she uncovered the truth. Emma had no choice but to move forward, despite the dangers. The note left behind after the break-in, the missing files, these were all signs that she was closing in on something huge. She couldn't back down now, not after everything she had uncovered. If she did, all the sacrifices would be for nothing. Her father had been right. The corruption in the system was bigger than anyone knew. The people who ran it didn't just manipulate the law, they had blood on their hands. With the files gone and her home ransacked, Emma had to get creative. She knew she couldn't just walk into a police station or a court of law with what she had. Whoever was behind her father's disappearance had influence everywhere. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that no one was going to believe her, not without proof. But Emma wasn't like everyone else. She had inherited her father's determination, his sense of justice, and she had a plan. She couldn't do this alone. Not anymore. Her father had trusted certain people, and maybe, just maybe, there was still someone out there who could help her. She had one person in mind, David Reynolds, an FBI agent her father had worked with before he disappeared. If anyone could help her take down the people behind this, it was Reynolds. He knew the system. He had worked with her father, and he had the resources to expose the corruption. Emma had no way of contacting him directly, but she had something else. An idea. She needed to get close to Stanton, to the heart of the system. The courthouse. She would have to take a huge risk, but she was willing to do whatever it took to expose the truth. She was running out of options, and time was running out. Over the next few days, Emma forged a letter pretending to be a law student looking for an internship. She had seen how her father worked, how lawyers and judges operated, and she knew she had to get inside the system. She sent the application with a fake resume and hoped for the best. It was a long shot, but she had no other choice. She was out of time, and she couldn't let fear stop her from acting. The letter she sent wasn't a lie. Not entirely. She had spent months researching Stanton and his connections. She knew that if she could get close to him, she could find the proof she needed to bring him down. She had to see the inner workings of his court. She had to see how deep the corruption ran. The wait felt endless, but Emma knew it was only a matter of time before the courthouse responded. Her heart skipped a beat when she received the letter confirming her internship. She was in. She didn't waste any time. Within weeks, Emma was inside the courthouse, walking the same halls where her father had worked. She kept her head down, blending in with the other interns and lawyers. Every day, she focused on staying under the radar, never letting anyone suspect her true intentions. But at night, after everyone else had gone home, Emma began her search. She combed through files, emails, and case records, looking for anything that could tie Stanton to her father's investigation. She knew that every moment she spent inside the courthouse brought her one step closer to exposing the truth. She was hunting for the final piece of the puzzle. Then, one evening, she found it. In the corner of the courthouse's record room, buried under a pile of old case files, Emma came across a list of names, some familiar, some not. But the most striking thing about the list was that it included her father's name. Emma's stomach twisted. She didn't need to read any further to know that this was the evidence she had been looking for. Her father had been investigating this very list before he disappeared. He had been looking into these people, trying to find out who they were and what they were hiding. But the list wasn't the only thing Emma found that night. At the very bottom of the list, written in the same messy handwriting that had appeared on her father's notes, was her own name. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The realization hit her hard. They knew she was onto them. Whoever had compiled this list had been watching her, waiting for her to make a move. And now, she was on their radar. Her hands shook as she backed away from the desk. It was clear now. She wasn't just investigating a few missing people. She was up against something much bigger, something so dangerous that it was willing to go to any lengths to silence her. But Emma was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. Before she could react, a sound from behind her made her freeze. Footsteps. Someone was coming. She quickly shoved the list into her bag and ducked into the nearest storage closet, holding her breath as the footsteps grew louder. Her heart raced, but she didn't dare move. Whoever was coming was too close, and if they saw her, she would be caught. Time seemed to slow as Emma waited, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. The footsteps passed by, and she exhaled slowly, relief flooding her chest. But she knew she couldn't stay hidden for long. The game had just changed. She wasn't just a girl looking for answers anymore. She was a target. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. The next few days were a blur. Emma knew she had to be careful. Whoever was behind this, whoever had been watching her, would be coming for her soon. They wouldn't just sit back and let her expose them. The walls were closing in. But Emma wasn't backing down. She had what she needed. She had proof. Solid, irrefutable proof that Judge Gregory Stanton was connected to a web of corruption that went all the way to the top. And now, with the list in hand, she had the leverage to take him down. She just had to survive long enough to make her move. Emma had made it this far. She had infiltrated the courthouse, uncovered the list, and now, with the proof in her hands, she was one step closer to exposing the truth. But deep down, she knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The people who were pulling the strings behind Judge Gregory Stanton's corruption wouldn't just let her walk away with the evidence. They would come for her. They would do everything in their power to silence her, just like they had done with her father. The danger was real. The walls were closing in, and Emma knew it was only a matter of time before she would be caught. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. She had to act. Her plan was simple: get the information out into the world. The truth had to be exposed, and she couldn't do it alone. But who could she trust? The FBI was the obvious answer. If anyone could help her bring down Stanton and the people behind him, it was them. She had been careful not to trust anyone within the system. The police had ignored her mother's cries for help when her father disappeared, and Emma wasn't about to trust them now. But there was one person who might be different: David Reynolds, the FBI agent her father had worked with. Emma had no direct way to contact him, but she had a hunch that he was still out there, still investigating the case in the shadows. She didn't know if he would believe her, but she had no choice but to try. The files she had found were the evidence they needed to take down the corrupt network running the justice system, and she couldn't let anyone stop her now. That night, as Emma made her way back to the courthouse, she found herself looking over her shoulder more than once. Every step felt like it could be her last. The fear gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. She was so close to the truth. She couldn't back down now. When she reached the courthouse, she quickly made her way to the back door, using the security badge she had gotten during her internship to gain access. She had one goal in mind: get the evidence to Reynolds. If she could just get the list into his hands, then they could finally take down Stanton and the others. They could expose the corruption for good. Emma's heart was pounding in her chest as she approached the office of the court administrator, where she knew the records were stored. She had a plan. She was going to copy the list and take it straight to Reynolds. It was risky, but it was the only chance she had. But as she entered the hallway, she heard a voice from behind her. "Emma." She froze. The voice was cold, calm, and familiar. It was Stanton's voice. Her blood ran cold as she turned to face him, her stomach twisting with dread. Judge Stanton stood there, his back to the dim hallway lights, his face unreadable. He wasn't alone. Two men stood behind him, their expressions hard, threatening. Emma's heart raced, but she stood her ground. She couldn't afford to show fear now. "I thought you were smarter than this," Stanton said, his eyes narrowing as he took a step forward. You should have stayed away from this. But now, you've crossed a line. And I'm afraid you're not going to make it out of here alive." Emma's hand tightened around the list in her pocket. Her mind was racing, but she didn't back down. She couldn't. This wasn't just about her father anymore. It was about taking down the entire corrupt system. "You've been covering up crimes for too long, Judge," Emma said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "But it's over now. I have the proof. I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Stanton chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You think you have proof? You think you're going to make a difference? You're just a child, Emma. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Emma took a step back, her mind working quickly. She couldn't let him intimidate her. Not now. She had come too far. But before she could think of her next move, a loud bang echoed through the courtroom, followed by the sound of the heavy courthouse doors slamming open. The chaos erupted. "FBI! Everyone stay where you are!" a voice shouted. A man in a dark suit stormed into the room, his badge visible on his chest. Emma's eyes widened in surprise as she saw the FBI agent step forward, his eyes locked onto Stanton. The entire room froze as the agent motioned to Stanton's two guards. "You're under arrest," the agent said. "This trial is now under federal jurisdiction." Emma stood still, her mind racing. This was it. This was her chance. Stanton was about to be exposed, but she couldn't let her guard down. Not yet. Stanton's expression darkened as he glared at the agent. "This is outrageous," he spat. "I'll have you know who I am. You can't just—" "You don't get to make the rules anymore," the agent cut him off. "You're done." Before anyone could react, the agent pulled out a pair of handcuffs and moved toward Stanton. But just as the agent was about to place them on Stanton's wrists, something unexpected happened. The doors to the courtroom flew open again, this time with a deafening crash. Several officers entered, their hands on their holsters, but they weren't here to arrest Stanton. They were here for something else. "Everyone, step aside," one of the officers barked as he moved toward Stanton. In a blur of motion, the officers grabbed Stanton and swiftly handcuffed him. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the judge's gavel slammed down repeatedly. But Emma hardly noticed. She was too focused on the figure standing near the back of the room. David Reynolds. Her heart leapt into her throat as she saw him standing in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked calm, almost like he had expected this to happen. He made his way to the front of the room, his eyes briefly meeting Emma's. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. Emma nodded, barely able to contain her excitement. This was it. The truth was finally coming to light. But as Reynolds approached her, she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach twist. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The courtroom was a whirlwind of activity as the FBI moved swiftly to secure Judge Gregory Stanton and his associates. Reporters shouted questions, flashes from cameras filled the air, and the atmosphere was chaotic, but Emma's eyes remained focused on one thing: David Reynolds. He was calm, his expression unreadable as he navigated through the crowd of stunned spectators and agents. The moment their eyes met, Emma felt a flicker of hope, mixed with a surge of fear. The truth was coming out, but the danger wasn't over. The real battle was just beginning. Reynolds made his way toward Emma, his steps deliberate, eyes never straying from her. He didn't say anything as he reached her, but his presence alone was enough to make her heart race. She knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. She had the proof, the list, the files. But there was something else she needed to know, something she hadn't even dared to consider until now. "How did you know about Stanton?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. I thought I was on my own." Reynolds gave her a grim smile, his eyes filled with understanding. "You're not alone, Emma. You never were." Before she could ask more, the sound of footsteps approaching interrupted them. A man in a dark suit, not one of the FBI agents, stepped into view. He moved with purpose, his face tense, and when Emma saw his eyes, her stomach dropped. It was her father. "Dad?" The word left Emma's lips in a breathless rush. She couldn't believe it. It couldn't be him. Her mind raced as she tried to process the impossibility of what she was seeing. Her father, the man she had thought was dead for months, was standing before her. Alive. Robert Richards, the detective she had been searching for, the man who had disappeared without a trace, was here, and he was very much alive. "Emma," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but still filled with that familiar strength. His eyes softened as they locked onto hers, and for the first time in months, Emma felt the crushing weight of relief. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice shaky. "I didn't want you to find out like this." Emma stood frozen for a moment, unable to process the reality in front of her. Her father, alive. She had spent so long searching for him, clinging to the hope that he hadn't abandoned them, that he hadn't been killed. But here he was, in the flesh, looking thinner, his clothes disheveled, but unmistakably him. "How?" Emma's voice cracked as she took a hesitant step toward him. "How are you? How is this even possible?" Reynolds stepped forward, his gaze intense. "It's a long story, one that's still unfolding. But we need to talk, Emma. There's a lot you don't know, a lot more than you think." Emma's head spun as her father's presence seemed to ground her, but the confusion and fear remained. "But how? You were gone. You were dead, Dad. I thought you were dead." Her father's eyes darkened, and he took a deep breath. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he touched her shoulder, grounding both of them. "I was never dead. But they wanted me to be. They wanted to erase me, erase the evidence I had found. They framed me for crimes I didn't commit. They put me in a cell, with no trial, no press, nothing. I've been in prison for months, Emma, while they ran their operation." Emma's mind reeled with the implications. Her father had been framed. He had been locked away by the same people who had orchestrated the entire system of corruption she had uncovered. It all made sense now. The missing files, the dead ends, the lies. Her father had been silenced to protect the powerful figures behind Judge Stanton and the rest of the corrupt network. "Who did this to you?" Emma demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "Who's behind all of this? You have to tell me." Her father's face twisted with bitterness as he sighed. "There's a man, a shadow behind all of this. Someone who pulls the strings, controls the players. Someone who's even more dangerous than Stanton or Davenport. His name's Mark Blackwood." Emma's stomach twisted at the name. Blackwood. She had heard it before, but she hadn't realized just how powerful he was. He was the true mastermind, the man who controlled everything, the man who had orchestrated her father's fall, and who had worked tirelessly to cover up the truth. "I knew it was bigger than Stanton," Emma whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "But this is all worse than I ever imagined." David Reynolds, who had been standing quietly, stepped closer. "We've been tracking Blackwood for years, but he's good. Too good. He's always one step ahead. It's not just the justice system he controls. It's the entire city. Judges, police, politicians. It's all connected, and Blackwood is the one who holds it all together." Her father nodded grimly. "I had everything. Files, recordings, evidence. But when I got too close, they took it all. They put me in that prison cell to keep me quiet. to keep me from exposing him. But they underestimated you, Emma. You've been doing what I couldn't. You've been getting closer to the truth, and now we have a chance." Emma's heart raced with a mix of fear and excitement. Her father was alive, but he wasn't free yet. Blackwood was still out there, pulling the strings, and he wasn't going to let Emma or her father take him down without a fight. "You're not safe yet," Reynolds warned, his voice serious. "Blackwood knows you're still alive, and he's not going to let this go. He'll come for you, Emma. He'll come for all of us." Emma nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "I'm not afraid of him." Her father smiled, pride in his eyes. "I knew you were strong, Emma. I always knew you'd fight for what's right. We're going to take him down. Together." The pieces were finally coming together. Stanton was arrested, but Blackwood was still out there, pulling the strings. Emma couldn't stop now. She wouldn't stop until the entire system of corruption was exposed and her father was free. The fight wasn't over. Emma felt a surge of determination that she hadn't realized she was capable of. Her father, alive and standing beside her, was a victory in itself, but they both knew that the battle wasn't won yet. The true mastermind behind everything, Mark Blackwood, was still free. And as long as he was, Emma and her father were in grave danger. It was like they had opened one door, only to see 1,000 others locked behind it. The corruption, the cover-ups, it all led to Blackwood. He was the one who had orchestrated everything, and now that Emma knew the full extent of the danger, she knew she couldn't stop until he was brought down. They had made a mistake by underestimating Blackwood. Now that he knew Emma was still alive and still digging for the truth, they were all in his crosshairs. And with Reynolds's warning, Emma realized just how much danger they were in. The people who worked for Blackwood were everywhere, hidden in plain sight, pulling strings behind the scenes. For a moment, Emma considered the impossible, walking away. Her father was alive, and they had made so much progress. But she couldn't. Her father wouldn't let her. This was their fight now, together. The system that had taken him, the system that had killed her father in every sense but physically, was still in place. If she backed down now, it would mean giving up everything. "We can't hide forever, Emma," her father said, his voice low, but the edge of urgency was there. "You've already exposed Stanton. But Blackwood, he's the real danger. He's the one who can make us disappear." Emma nodded, her thoughts racing. "We need to find him. We need to expose him, his entire network. And we need to do it before he realizes we're coming for him." Her father's eyes darkened, the weight of their situation clearly not lost on him. "I know, but he's good. He's always one step ahead. He controls everything. Politicians, judges, the police. If he doesn't want something to come to light, it doesn't. We have to be careful. He doesn't just play with the law. He bends it until it breaks." Emma clenched her fists, her jaw set in determination. "Then we break him. He's already underestimated us once. He thinks we're just pawns in his game. But he's wrong." Reynolds, who had been silently watching the exchange, spoke up. "We don't have much time. If Blackwood finds out you're still alive, he'll try to get to you before you can expose him. The FBI's already been tracking him for years, but he's always ahead of the game. We need to move fast." Emma nodded. She had already made up her mind. There was no going back now. It was time to take action. But as the urgency of their situation set in, Emma's mind was torn. She couldn't trust just anyone. The people closest to her had been silent or complicit in her father's downfall. The police, her teachers, even some of her friends. anyone could be working for Blackwood. Emma had to rely on those she knew she could trust, her father and Reynolds. Together, they might stand a chance. Emma knew there was one more step she needed to take. She needed to gather more evidence. The files she had already found weren't enough. Blackwood was too dangerous, too elusive. She needed concrete proof, something that would expose him beyond any doubt. Reynolds took out his phone, scanning the screen with practiced precision. "I've got a contact, someone who's been tracking Blackwood's movements. She's a reporter, Alicia Monroe. She's the one person who might be able to get us the media exposure we need. If she gets this story, Blackwood won't be able to control it anymore." Emma felt a flicker of hope. If they could get the media involved, it would force Blackwood into the open. The only problem was getting close enough to Monroe and convincing her to take the risk. "What's the plan?" Emma asked. Reynolds took a deep breath. "We meet Monroe. She's got access to the kind of information Blackwood doesn't want out there. We give her the proof. She's our best shot at getting the public on our side, at forcing Blackwood into a corner." "But we can't trust anyone else," Emma said, the weight of the situation clear in her voice. "Not the police, not the courts. It's all rigged." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing it reassuringly. "We've been fighting for justice our entire lives, Emma. We've come this far. Now we finish it." The next few days were a blur of preparations. Emma knew they had to stay off the radar. Blackwood's people were everywhere, and one wrong move could lead them straight into a trap. Reynolds kept a low profile, and Emma made sure to keep her movements discreet. She couldn't afford to be reckless. It was late one evening when they received the message from Monroe. "Meet me at Union Station. Midnight. Don't be followed." Emma's heart raced. This was it. They were going to meet Monroe, the journalist who had the power to expose Blackwood, to bring everything crashing down. But there was a catch. If Blackwood knew about the meeting, it would be their last. The plan was simple. Get the information to Monroe, show her the proof, and hope she could get the story to the public. If they could get it out into the media, Blackwood's empire would start to crumble. But even with everything they had, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. At midnight, Emma, her father, and Reynolds drove to Union Station, the headlights of their car cutting through the darkness. They parked a few blocks away, taking care not to be seen, and started walking toward the station. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made Emma's skin crawl. Every corner, every shadow felt like it could be hiding a threat. They were getting close. Suddenly, Reynolds froze, his eyes scanning the area. "Stay alert," he muttered. "Something's not right." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts screamed at her that something was wrong. Before she could react, the sound of approaching footsteps made her turn toward the alleyway ahead. A figure stepped out of the shadows. "Monroe!" Emma called, her voice low. The figure stopped, and a familiar smile spread across her face. But Emma's relief was short-lived. The smile didn't reach Monroe's eyes. "This is a mistake," Monroe said, her voice tense. "They know you're here." The words, "they know you're here," hung in the air like a death sentence. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she stared at Alicia Monroe, trying to read her face, but the sharp edge of her expression only deepened Emma's anxiety. This was the moment she had been working toward, but now it seemed like they were stepping straight into the heart of a trap. Monroe had been their one shot at getting the truth out there, the journalist who could expose Blackwood's network to the world. And yet, the woman standing before them now looked anything but trustworthy. Before Emma could respond, Monroe raised a hand, signaling for them to be quiet. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the area nervously. "We need to move. Now." "Move where?" Reynolds asked, his voice a mixture of suspicion and urgency. Monroe looked over at him, her face still composed, but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. "They know too much. Blackwood's people are already here, waiting for us. If we don't get to my contact before they close in, everything we've worked for will be erased." Emma's stomach churned. The tension in the air was thick enough to suffocate her. Every instinct told her that they were running out of time, and now they were walking into even more danger. But she didn't have time to ask more questions. Reynolds nodded, signaling for them to follow. They started moving quickly through the darkened streets, every footstep feeling louder than the last. Emma's mind raced. They had come so far, but now she was beginning to understand just how deep Blackwood's influence really went. If Monroe was right, they weren't just fighting a corrupt judge or a rogue politician. They were fighting an entire system, an underground empire built on lies, manipulation, and murder. As they approached a narrow alley, Monroe suddenly stopped. She turned to Emma and her father. "This is it," she said, her voice low. "We need to be quick." Reynolds stepped forward, scanning the surroundings. "Are you sure we can trust your contact?" Monroe nodded. "I've worked with him before. He's the real deal." Emma glanced at her father, who gave her a brief nod of reassurance. She trusted him, and if he thought they could trust Monroe, that was good enough for her. But the nagging feeling that something was wrong still clung to her. Monroe turned to lead them into the alley. The walls on either side were tall and imposing, casting long shadows. A single dim street lamp flickered overhead, casting an eerie light over their path. As they moved deeper into the alley, the sound of their footsteps was drowned by the unsettling quiet that surrounded them. The hairs on the back of Emma's neck stood up. And then it happened. A sharp, blinding flash of light illuminated the alley, followed by the distinct sound of gunfire. The force of the explosion from the flashbang sent Emma stumbling backward, her heart racing as her vision swam. She barely registered the sound of shuffling footsteps before the harsh grip of a hand closed around her arm, yanking her forward. Reynolds was already pulling out his weapon, his eyes scanning the darkened alley. Monroe had already ducked behind a dumpster, her hand on her head as she shielded herself from the light. "Get down!" Reynolds barked as more footsteps approached. The alley was filling with figures, their movements fast and deliberate. Emma could barely make out their silhouettes in the sudden chaos. "Move! Move! Move!" Reynolds shouted again, and they all sprinted toward the back exit of the alley. But Emma felt the pulse of panic in her chest. They were being herded, trapped. It wasn't just Blackwood's men after them now. They had walked straight into the lion's den, and every step they took brought them closer to being cornered. Just as Emma thought they were going to make it out, she heard a voice behind them. A cold, familiar voice that made her blood freeze. "Emma Richards! It's time to end this!" She whipped around, her heart in her throat, to see none other than Mark Blackwood himself, standing in the mouth of the alley. His sharp suit and steely expression were unmistakable, and his cold eyes locked onto hers. "You!" she breathed, stepping forward in defiance, though her legs felt like lead. "This ends now. I'm exposing everything you've done." Blackwood smirked, his face showing no sign of worry. "You think you can stop this? You're a child, Emma. You think you've uncovered everything? What you don't realize is that this is just the beginning. You're playing a game you don't understand." Emma swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. She wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. She had come too far. "You're the one who doesn't understand. I have everything I need to bring you down. You're finished." Blackwood's smirk widened, but there was a coldness behind his eyes that sent a chill down Emma's spine. You think you have proof? You think your little list will stop me? Let me tell you something, Emma. The real power is never where you think it is. There's always another move, another layer to the game. Before Emma could respond, the world seemed to shift. In an instant, Blackwood's men closed in, surrounding them. Emma could feel the walls closing in, her options narrowing by the second. She needed to get out of here, fast. But her father's voice cut through the chaos. "Reynolds, get her out of here!" Robert Richards shouted, pushing Emma toward the back of the alley. "Now!" But before they could make it, Blackwood stepped forward, blocking their path. No one's going anywhere. Just then, a gunshot rang out. Emma froze, her heart nearly stopping in her chest. The bullet wasn't aimed at her. It had struck Blackwood's man closest to her, sending him tumbling to the ground. A second shot rang out, and then a third. From the darkness emerged another figure, Monroe's contact. He was holding a silenced pistol, his face grim as he moved toward them. "I told you," Monroe muttered, standing behind the dumpster and looking relieved but wary. "I've got people watching your back." Emma didn't hesitate. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she followed Reynolds and her father into the darkness of the alley, the gunfire ringing out behind them. They reached the end of the alley just as another van pulled up, its headlights blinding in the distance. Reynolds shoved Emma into the back of the van, and her father followed close behind. They didn't have time to think. They didn't have time to process what had just happened. Monroe's contact jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind him. "Hold on," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This is far from over." The van sped through the narrow streets, the engine roaring as it tore through the night. Emma's heart was pounding in her chest, but she barely noticed the thumping in her ears. Her mind was elsewhere, processing everything that had just happened, everything that had brought them here. The gunshots, the confrontation with Blackwood, the fact that they were now running for their lives. They had barely escaped with their lives, and yet, somehow, they were still in the game. Emma was still alive, her father was alive, and Reynolds was still fighting alongside them. But they weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. She glanced at her father, who sat beside her in the back of the van. His face was grim, but there was something in his eyes that told her he wasn't giving up. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "We're not done yet," Robert said, his voice low but firm. "We're getting closer, Emma. Blackwood's empire is starting to crack. He's desperate, and that's exactly what we need." Emma nodded, her hands clenched into fists as she thought about what was at stake. Blackwood wasn't just going to give up quietly. He was too powerful, too connected. The entire justice system was at his mercy, and as long as he was free, Emma and her father would never be truly safe. The people who were helping them now, Reynolds, Monroe, and the others, were taking huge risks by standing with them. If Blackwood found out who was helping them, they would all be in danger. But there was a part of Emma that felt something else. Hope. They had survived the worst, and they were still standing. Blackwood had underestimated them before. He thought they were powerless. But now, with all the evidence they had gathered, with the truth finally on their side, Emma knew they were more dangerous than ever. Reynolds turned to her, his eyes sharp, his voice urgent. "We need to move fast. Blackwood knows we're coming for him. He's already making his next move. If we don't act now, he'll bury us before we can even get close." "I know," Emma said, her voice steady despite the fear that still gnawed at her. "But we can't just keep running. We need to expose him. We need to make sure the world knows who he really is." Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with pride. "You're right. We've come too far to turn back now. It's time to take him down." They were heading toward Monroe's contact, a safe house on the outskirts of town. The plan was simple: get the files, get the evidence, and then expose everything. But nothing was ever simple with Blackwood. He had eyes everywhere, and they knew it wouldn't be easy. The media was their last chance to break the story wide open. If they could leak the evidence to the right people, if they could get it to the public, Blackwood would have nowhere to hide. But even as they made their way toward the safe house, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The closer they got, the more her instincts screamed that something wasn't right. Every turn, every alleyway felt like it could be a trap. Blackwood was patient, calculating. If he knew they were coming for him, he would be ready. As they pulled up to the safe house, Monroe's contact ushered them inside quickly, locking the door behind them. The walls of the safe house were lined with monitors, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and tension. It was the kind of place where the truth was hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Monroe stepped forward, her face grim. "We've got one shot at this," she said. "Once the story breaks, there's no going back. Blackwood will make sure we all pay for this." Emma nodded, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "We can't stop now. We've come too far." Her father stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "It's time to finish this. We expose Blackwood. We expose everything." Monroe turned to the screens, typing rapidly as she pulled up the files. "Once this is out, Blackwood won't be able to control it anymore. His empire will crumble." Emma watched as the files were uploaded to secure servers, the evidence being broadcast to every major news network, every journalist in the country. The names, the transactions, the missing people, the deaths, all of it. It was finally out in the open. Blackwood's corruption couldn't hide anymore. The people he had silenced would finally have their voices heard. But just as Emma allowed herself a moment of relief, she heard the sound of footsteps outside the door. Her heart stopped. It was too soon. They had been too late. "Stay down," Reynolds whispered, his hand on his weapon. "We've got company." The door to the safe house burst open, and in the darkness, Emma saw the glint of gunmetal. Blackwood's men had found them. The battle wasn't over yet. Her father grabbed her arm, pulling her into a corner of the room. "We've got to hold them off long enough for the information to get out." Emma's pulse raced, the adrenaline flooding her system. She had come this far. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let Blackwood win. Gunshots rang out as they scrambled for cover. The safe house became a battlefield, the walls reverberating with the sound of bullets. Emma clutched her father's arm, staying low as the chaos erupted around them. But through the haze of gunfire, Emma noticed something. The screens. They were still uploading the files. They hadn't been stopped. The world would know the truth. They had done it. It was over. Epilogue: The collapse of the empire. Days later, the media erupted with breaking news, the files, the names, the revelations. The story was everywhere. Blackwood's name was finally in the light, and the network he had built through years of manipulation and deceit came crashing down. He was arrested, and as the truth spread like wildfire, people who had been hidden in the shadows began to emerge, testifying, telling their stories. Emma sat in her living room, the weight of what had happened settling in. The city was beginning to change. The corrupt officials, the people who had manipulated the system, were finally facing justice. But Emma knew that it wasn't over. Her father was free. The justice system was in the process of being reformed. But Blackwood's empire had been much more than a few bad men in power. It had been a broken system. and it would take time to fix. Emma sat in silence, her fingers tracing the pendant around her neck, a memento of her father's work. It wasn't just the end of Blackwood's reign, it was the beginning of something new. She knew there was still work to do, but for the first time in a long while, Emma felt a sense of peace. The fight for justice wasn't over yet, but she was ready for whatever came next.